Welcome to CJWinter How-To video series. Here at CJWinter, we provide better tools, fast delivery, great service, and value.
Today we're going to go through the CJWinter pneumatic attachment, teardown, inspect, and repair. We'll be looking at a 151 SA attachment. We'll look at the pneumatic air cylinder, the key components of that, roll pins and fulcrum pins, gear train, compensator assembly, and roll arms and brackets.
Okay, these are some of the tools you're going to need. An 1.25" wrench, some verniers, depth mics, a 7/16 and 9/16 deep well socket. Might as well have the wrenches handy. Piece of 5" or 5/8 square stock brass, and then you're gonna have to round the ends off, and I'll show you what that's for later. Spring retainer pliers, Allen wrenches, screwdrivers. You got a special screwdriver with a slot in it. I'll show you what that's used for later. Verniers and depth mics. And then we are going to use mobile SHC synthetic grease for the O-rings and cylinder and inside components. A little bit of Vibrotite. And then for all the air fittings, we use Loctite 567 thread sealant. Alright, I'm going to start disassembling, and I usually get rid of the arms, take the wedge out, and then I can take the locking bolts off the cylinder and slide everything right out. So the first thing we're going to do is take out these locking screws for the fulcrum. Once you get that out, you just push that down through, get your fulcrum out. Take a look at that, make sure it's not too worn out. If you get any wear on this, you're going to want to replace it. Set your arms, pull your arms out to the side like this. Pull one out, give it a twist. Allows you to push it in there and allows the other one to come out. Bring the arms right out, set them aside for now. Now I'm going to go on and remove the wedge. The way I do that is turn the adjusting knob to the minus direction. Put a little blast of air into the quick exhaust valve. Pushes the cylinder ahead, giving you access to the wedge roll pin and locking screw. Take the locking screw out, push the pin through, and the wedge comes out. Give a little blast of air into this port, and it'll send the piston back to home. Now I can remove the cylinder locking screws. Remove the screw cover, and then there's a rubber washer that covers the thread in the bracket. Just keeps the chips and coolant out of there. you get those out, you'll be able to pull that right apart. And you can take your bracket and set that aside and finish turning down the cylinder. Okay, so now we're going to continue to disassemble the cylinder end of the attachment. And we need to get that nut to loosen up from the cylinder shaft. And the way I do that is clamp on the two flats in a vise and take the 1¼ wrench on that nut. Okay, so just lift the end plate up so you can access the nut and loosen that baby up. So it's tight, so it might take a little bit of effort. Just hand loosen that up. And there you go. Now you got your adjusting screw, or adjusting nut, adjusting screw. Set that aside for right this minute. Pop this out of the vise. Then if you just push on the cylinder shaft, you'll be able to get the cylinder out, and you can clean the inside of that out. Look for any damage on the inside. Just run your nail around. If you got any bad scarring or scraping in there from, it'll leave a groove from this O-ring getting worn out. And then you have the piston will rub on the inside of the wall. So you have metal to metal. And if you can feel it with your nail, you're going to want to replace the cylinder. Also look for damage on the outside that may protrude on the inside. Usually if wrenches slip or something like that and the cylinder wall gets hit on the outside, you'll see it on the inside, and you're going to want to toss the cylinder and get a new one, because every time this passes by, it's going to rub on that spot and cause you some headaches. And then at this point, you can check your cylinder shaft OD, make sure it's not scarred up, because when it's cycling, the cylinder shaft passes through this bushing here. There's an O-ring inside. If that gets worn, again, you have metal to metal. You'll have to replace the bushing and the shaft if it gets too bad. Because if it gets scored up, you put a new wash or O-ring in here. After a little while, you're just going to tear that new O-ring up. Inspect your OD of your piston. Look for any flat spots or scoring of any type. And if that's scored up or has a flat spot from rubbing on the inside of the cylinder, get rid of that. You're going to want to replace it and save yourself some headaches down the road. Inside is an O-ring. This is a two-piece assembly. So when you replace the O-ring inside here, you're going to remove the set screw. You're going to take a same size thread screw, and you're going to make it flat on the end. Deeper it a little bit on the fiber wheel so that it's not sharp. Give this a quarter turn. Bring the screw in till it bottoms out on the inside of on the shaft in there. Back it off a little bit. Maybe I'll have to put it in place. Lift that out. So what the screw does is it fills that void of the threaded hole. If you don't put this screw in there, what happens when you disassemble it or assemble it, the O-ring squirts into that threaded hole and cuts it off. It's like a cookie cutter, just whoosh, O-ring's no good. So this is very important to use that tool to fill that void.
Insert it and remove it.
Yep, for assembly and disassembly. But disassembly, not so much, because if you're going to replace the O-ring, it doesn't matter if it's cut or not. But it just gives you an idea how, when you put the new one in, how you need to set that screw so that it does not get cut. It's kind of good practice. You can just even leave it set so that when you reassemble it, it's already in the right position. Okay, now I'm going to remove I'm going to take the adjusting screw out. And the way to do that is to remove the locking screw here, or locking nut. Give that a good twist. Use your screwdriver, put it in the slot here. Screw the knob, and out comes the adjusting screw. Now the adjusting screw, you can see your adjusting nut here. This is what moves up and down the shaft as you turn your pitch adjustment knob. And then the nut's going to come up and make contact, breaks that seal, sends the air to the signal to the four-way to change direction. Over time, you may have damage to the adjusting nut from the locking nut here making contact. You're going to want this nut to pass through the broached hole in the cylinder shaft. That's got to slide in there free, because if it's not, it could compromise your operation of the attachment. Okay, so if you have to remove this stop nut, before you do that, you want to take a measurement from the flange to the bottom of that stop nut, which is 2 inches, 327 thousandths. That dimension is very important for that sets your stroke length of the attachment, puts it to the maximum adjustment. So if you need to replace the stop nut, you're going to have to set that dimension, bring your adjusting nut up, and lock the nut into place so that you can drill that 16th hole for the spring pin to go in, so that this stop nut cannot back out. It has to be locked in place. Otherwise it could come off, and then your adjusting nut comes off the end of the screw and you got big problems. Okay, now I'm going to remove the compensator gear train and start out removing the center gear guard. It just pops out. There's a little groove on there that goes into a slot on the bracket. Now you can see your gear train. Check the teeth, make sure they're in good shape. Check for slop up and down, left and right. If you have any slop up or down or left or right, you're going to want to replace the bushing, and also pay attention to your external gear when you disassemble it, because you want that to be nice and tight. Remove the snap ring. Loosen up the lock screw on the adjusting collar. Pull the adjusting collar off. Just cup your hand around, because there's 2 springs in here that could come flying out. If you cup your hand around there. There's your two springs. Make sure they're in good shape. You don't want them, if they come out and they're curled or crunched down on one end. That's from a heavy compensation. You're going to want to replace those. So just make sure they're in good shape. Check the wedge on your pen. Make sure that that's still in good shape. You want to make sure that's good and sharp. If you have a crash or anything, these two things could get damaged. Now we're going to remove the spring retainer. There's a little locking nut that's, or locking backing screw on here. And then underneath that is a dog point screw that holds the spring retainer on. That dog point goes into your external gear, and that keeps the spring retainer from free spinning. So you got to make sure that when you're reassembling, the dog point goes into the detent, very important, and that it's not too tight so that you can still move the internal gear freely. So now you have this apart, you can check the OD of your external gear, look at your bushing, ID, make sure it's not too worn out. If either are worn, replace it. Make sure your internal gear passes through the external freely with no binding or anything like that, because these have to, in order for it to compensate right, they have to spin free of independently of each other. Okay, that's that on there. Now I'm going to go right into the roll arms. Set this aside for right now. Oh. One thing I want to go over is looking for wear on the bracket. I always look for cracks in this area here, around the compensator. Check the holes for the fulcrums to make sure they're not getting oblonged or worn out. Check your surfaces here to make sure they're not getting too damaged, because you're locating on your adapter plates. So you want to make sure that this is a good surface that you're mounting that on, so that you don't get any high spots, or you don't want your surfaces compromised by dings or dents.
We recommend stoning those surfaces when you go to remount the attachment, just to make sure it's flat.
Check your keys, make sure they're still in good shape. These keys can be, depending on how you're using the attachment, there's slots on both sides for those. You just move them wherever you need them, depending on what position you're rolling in. I'm going to show you how to disassemble and inspect the roll arms. I usually start out removing the roll arm spring, wedge rollers, and the pin. Loosen up that screw. Take your pin out, inspect the pin, make sure it's not getting worn out from the wedge roller over time. Make sure your wedge rollers are in good shape. Check your spring, make sure these ears aren't getting sprung. Sometimes they'll come out and it'll be stretched out in that state. If it's stretched out or compromised in any way, get a new one, because it's important that the arms stay tight to the wedge when it's in between cycles. From here, just remove your idler gear guard. And this being a 151 has an intermediate roll gear. You can see that right there. You have your idler, intermediate idler gear. The reason that's in there is because this has a little bit of a longer arm than, let's say, your 141, which will not have that intermediate idler gear in there because the idler gear can make contact to the roll gear. So you're going to want to get to your idler gear, just remove this locking screw here, push that pin out, tip it up, idler, intermediate idler comes out, then you can get your idler gear out. Inspect the teeth, make sure everything's in good shape, look at your IDs, check the pen, make sure it's not getting worn. Do the same thing on the other side. Now you can flip the roll, or don't flip them over yet. We're going to loosen up the locking screw so we can take the roll pin out, the carbide roll pin. You're going to loosen that up and push that. Then you can take the pin out and inspect the OD, make sure there's no galling. Make sure that the ends aren't broken out. If this gets put in the wrong way, people will take a punch or something and push the pin out rather than loosen up the bolts. They snap that little ledge off. Any damage to the pin, I would get a new one. And the carbide pins need to be high polish, quality carbide. It's going to save you on roll life because your ID of your roll is spinning on there, and you want that high polish so you have less friction. Check the gear teeth on your roll gear. Make sure they're all in good shape. Check the tangs, make sure they're in good shape, not damaged over time, because that's what goes into your thread roll and drives the thread roll. You want to make sure those are all in good shape. You don't want to put a new set of thread rolls in and on a bad pin or bad set of gears and compromise a new set of thread rolls. Start the pin out. Check your gear. Then you want to inspect your arms. You want to look for any galling on the surface or this surface. And that would be from your distance here being compromised, either heavy hit, crash, somebody dropped the attachment. These need to slide in here nice and free so that they operate with no dragging or anything like that, because you want that action, opening and closing action, to always be working. If you see damage on that surface, you're going to see it on here, on the bracket. You're going to want to get new brackets, possibly new arm, probably new arms, because all this damage is just going to compromise the operation. You're going to notice that there's a bushing here with 2 set screws. The reason that has set screws on it, loosen these up. If you're using a DR1 thread roll, full width, it's going to fill up this whole pocket. Therefore, you will not be able to put the roll in unless you remove the roll gear. So in order to assemble everything, you put your DR1 thread roll in, You're going to have to take the whole gear train apart, basically. Push this bushing out of here. You would put your DR1 roll in there. Take the roll gear, drop that in so it lines up with the DR1 drive slots, and then put the bushing back in. Make sure it's down all the way. And line up the undercuts for the flathead screw to go in. Another thing to look for on the arms, as far as wear, is this area right here. If anything gets loosened up over time and thread rolling gets banged around, this hole will get out of shape, and your pin may not hold true when thread rolling. And you want that pin not to move around while you're thread rolling. Loosen up, compromise your rolls. So I always check the holes. You can check the, make sure the tang's not broken on these bushings also, because it won't hold tight. And I think that's it. The roll arm gets too much side pressure, could snap right there. So you want to check for any kind of cracks or anything right there. And that's about it. Now we're going to start reassembling after we get our new O-rings and inspect everything and make sure we got good parts. Start out putting your adjusting screw into the slot. Adjusting that. Tighten that down. Screwdriver. Make sure it's good and tight. Lock nut. Make sure that's locked down. You want to make sure that this adjusting screw is tight to the adjusting knob is tight to the adjusting screw, so that when you make pitch adjustments, if that's not tight, you could be turning the knob thinking you're moving the adjusting nut, when in reality all you're doing is turning the adjusting knob on the end of the screw out here if this is loose. You'll be wondering why you're not making adjustments or why your pitch is fluctuating a lot. So you want to make sure that this knob is tight to the screw and locked down. Now we're going to assemble the wedge adapter to the cylinder shaft. Take an O-ring. Use your grease, put the O-ring on into the groove. Take some grease and put on the outside of the shaft so it slides in the cylinder shaft manually. Make sure you have the flat screw in there so that you don't cut the O-ring when you're assembling. That hole has to be filled when you put this in, or the O-ring is going to squirt through there and it's going to get cut off, and then you'll have an air leak. You have to disassemble the whole thing to fix this. So it's best to make sure you get it. Just bring it in so that starts in. Bring that screw until it touches, back it off a little bit. You can line up your screw detent. Push that down in there. Remove your screw. You'll see there's no little pieces. If it did get cut, usually the piece will end up on the end of the screw. Put a little Vibratite on the screw here before you assemble it, just so it don't back out on you. Make sure the detent's lined up with the hole for the screw to go into. Tighten that baby down. It's good to go. Flip it over. Put your next O-ring on. This is for the cylinder shaft to the piston. You want to just go over the threads. You don't want to rake it down over the thread, so I always put my hand on the other side, bring it all the way down. Just go around it. Make sure you don't roll it. Make sure it's seated all the way down. The piston has a counter bore on one side and not on the other. That counter bore is to go over the O-ring. So when you reassemble it, the counter bore goes towards the O-ring. And then just push that down. Make sure you're up against the two components are together. And you'll see that there's not a counter bore there, it's smooth. Take a little grease, put on the adjusting nut ears, because that's going to be sliding in and out of the broach. So it's a good idea to keep that lubed up. Bring it around till it slides in. Bring this in hand tight. Take one of the thin O-rings. It's going to go on the end plate. This is a face seal, so you got to make sure you get it down into the proper groove. You can't just lay it in there and expect it to assemble right. So you just kind of start it into the groove all the way around. To prevent it from squirting out when you put the cylinder on, because the cylinder is going to meet that. Like I said, it's a face seal, so it's going to come down on top of that. Get your piston O-ring, throw that on. Take your cylinder and lube the inside of that up. You want to just put a good film of grease on the inside. You don't have to go crazy. You don't want big chunks or anything in there. You just want a good coating of grease on the inside of that cylinder wall. Slide that over the top. Press it down. Seat that O-ring on the bottom. Make sure there's no squirts up where the O-ring is squirted out. I always wipe off my fingerprints. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to put the wedge plunger in. That goes into the wedge adapter. There's a spring, a plunger, and then the locking screw has a hole in it and screwdriver slot, and that's what we use the special screwdriver with the slot in it. I'll show you how that works. Because this pin is going to go inside there. The screwdriver will go over that and allow you to tighten the screw down without hitting the plunger. I put a little bit of Vibratite on that locking screw just to help it from trying to back out of there. Put those together, drop it down in the hole here. Start threading that in. I use my depth mics to make sure that the two pin heads are at the same height. And from the ear here down should be 460 thousandths. So once you got those even, you can put your wedge in just to make sure. Because what that does is set the wedge, when you make the change, it's going to sit flat. And you should be able to put the pin in freely without having to compress the wedge. And it's going to work fine. And then if you have to do a wedge change, you just push the pin out, and your next whatever wedge you're going to use will sit right on top of those and allow you to put the pin back in without any trouble. We're going to lock the cylinder shaft to the cylinder shaft locking nut. The way we're going to do that is clamp on these two ears. Same way we disassembled it. Stand that up, tighten down on the ears, 1.25 inch wrench. You're gonna tighten that baby down. You want that good and tight. Remove it. Push your cylinder back in position. Now we're going to assemble the cylinder to the bracket. I'll take a little bit of grease, coat up the O-ring. This O-ring is the one that goes in the inside of the brass bushing here. There's a little groove in there. Just feed that in there. Make sure it's in there. Put a little bit of grease around in the inside of that bushing. This little thin O-ring here is going to go into the groove on the back of the bracket the same way as the end plate. So you want to kind of feed it down into the smaller groove so it doesn't squirt out during assembly, because it's a face seal basically. So that cylinder is going to come down on top of it. Make sure your air fitting holes are facing the same way as the air fitting on the bracket. And just push that down. Make sure the O-ring is good and sealed. Wipe all this down. Put in the cylinder locking screws. Put your little rubber washer down first. Cylinder screw tube. bring these down. Just hand snug for right now. Lay it down and tighten them up. I use the crisscross theory as we tighten it up. Kind of like what you do with your car tires. And that's got the cylinder attached to the bracket. Okay, now I'm going to put the fittings on the end plate. And we got the quick exhaust and the pilot valve. I want to just make sure that the pilot valve, if you didn't replace that, just make sure it's clear of any kind of gunk or anything. Any kind of grime or anything like that could compromise the operation of this pilot valve, which sends a signal to the four-way and changes your direction. Any doubt that you have that it might be compromised, I would get a new one. Also, this is a quick exhaust, and inside here is a valve, a little rubber garment that opens and closes and lets the air through. Any kind of grime or anything that gets in there could compromise that from operating properly. And you'll notice we use the cone muffler on this item. We found that the flat ones could compromise the cycle of the attachment over time with grime and oil and whatnot. So we go with the cone and gives it a lot longer cycle life. So I'm going to assemble these. So we use our thread sealant on all the pipe threads. Just put a little bit on there, coat it around. And I'll just hand tighten this in there for now. Start that in by hand. You want this so that your air fitting's pointing out the back. In this direction, just for hookup, it keeps the lines out of the way during operation. Now you're going to put your little pilot valve on. Make sure you don't get any sealant in the inside so you compromise the valve in there. 7/16 deep well. Tight. Don't over tighten it because you can snap that off. So just snug it up. You want it tight, but not. You don't need to crank on it. And then we're going to put the quick disconnect in there.
What's the difference between the two?
The quick disconnects, you'll notice, are different. The front has got like a thinner pilot. The one that goes on the back has got the wider adapter connection. You want to make sure that the wider one always goes to the back, because when you hook up your four-way, it's only going to hook up one. The quick disconnect's going to only go on one on the right, on the proper adapter. And if you have these switched, then you're going to compromise the operation of the four-way. It won't work right. So you always got to make sure that the wider adapter goes on the back. the air fittings. Okay, so now I'm going to put the wedge in and start putting the compensator back together. And again, when you put the wedge in, you want to make sure you get the piston or the cylinder shaft out so you can have access to the when you put the pin in and the locking screw. The further you got it out, the easier it makes it to assemble. So I just turn that into the minus and put a little black back. You see the cylinder shaft comes out. Put your wedge in there. You can line up your wedge, make sure it's parallel with the openings here. Slide the pin in. Put the locking screw on. Lock that on. We'll blast the air in the back. We'll take the cylinder to the home. Now you can start on the compensator, putting that back together. We'll take our two compensator gears, making sure that they go together smoothly. Slide it into the bushing. Spring retainer. You want to make sure your detent's pointed up so you know where it is. Dog point screws in there. It's going to go over the top. That detent. And we're going to tighten that dog point screw down. Make sure we're in the detent. Just check it. Make sure. Snug that down a little bit. Make sure your internal gear still comes out. Make sure everything turns free. Put the backer screw in. Lock that down. Make sure the internal gear still turns. If you lock this down too tight, you're going to bind these two up and you won't be able to slide that internal gear out or turn it. If that happens, you got to loosen everything up until they can turn independent of each other and still move in freely. Now we're going to put the springs in. Put one spring in there. You put your other one in. You're going to want it to stick up a little bit so that when you assemble the adjusting collar, the wedge, you're going to bank up against the spring there that's sticking up. Give it a little twist and then push it down. And that'll ensure that you're between the two compensator springs. So just put that in there, give it a turn and push down. You can check it by just holding the gears and moving that back and forth, and you'll feel the spring action by doing that, and you'll know you're in between. If you miss getting it in between, just disassemble it, try again. It's got to be in between there in order for the compensator to work properly. Lock the locking screw down. Put the spring retainer back on. Make sure that's in the groove. Make sure everything spins free. Put your center gear guard back on. Make sure everything still turns. Now you can assemble the roll arms. Now we're going to reassemble the roll arms. And I usually start out with the wedge roller pin. Wedge roller. And your spring. Make sure when you put the spring in, the see the hook, how it comes around. I usually put the open end down, the locking screw in, slide that tab in the slot on the arm on the other side. Line up the flat. Lock that down. Next, you're going to put your idler gears in. The idler gears have to be opposing each other. I'll show you what I mean by that. You can see that the idler gear teeth on this side are up against that face. Idler gear teeth on this side are up on this face. That's so that when you put them into the roll arm bracket, the idler gear is going to make contact. One's going to make contact with the internal, and one's going to make contact with the external gear, and that's going to give you your proper operation of the compensator. So if they were both on, for say like that, you would only be on one of the gears and you would get no compensation out of the attachment. So always make sure they're opposing. You're going to drop in your intermediate idler gear. You put your finger in the inside there to kind of guide it up. Put the pin in. Bring it in flush. Put the locking screw on the flat.
Dog points.
Yeah, these are dog point screws. Lock that down. Put your idler gear covers on. Rotate that over. Okay, so now we're going to put the high polished carbide pin in the roll gear. Again, you just want to make sure your tangs are good on the roll gear. There's no scuff marks or anything on the carbide roll pin. Just slide that in. Like I said before, the flat, larger flat, is so that it can slide in without adjusting the screw right here. It's set from the factory at 0, so if you haven't had to do any taper adjustment, you should be able to loosen up the lock screw and slide that pin out, change your rolls, slide that pin back in, again without touching that screw, lock this locking screw down, and you should be at 0 with your new set of rolls and not have to worry about touching that screw. And if you do have to adjust that, we have another video that shows how to set your taper adjustment pin or your thread rolling pin at 0. Just lock that down. So if this is set right, loosen this up, slide that pin out, and you should be able to slide it back in there, lock it back down. That's what you want. Do the same on the other side. Now we can put the arm assembly into the bracket. The way we're going to do that, this is going to be standing up here. I'm going to take the arms, slide it in, bring one out, bring the other one out, I do is usually set this down like this. That drops the idler gear into the gear train, kind of self-aligning it. So get your pin in there, line the flat up for the locking screw. Lock that down. Flip it over. Locate your flat. Make sure you can line that up with the locking screw hole. Once you get it locked in, make sure you're put your gears in place. Rotate the compensator, make sure the gear train's moving free, make sure the arms are moving free, and you're all assembled. One thing I want to mention is if you have to do a O-ring change, we sell a kit with all the O-rings that you need, and it's a 141-801, and that's good for the 141 and the 151 thread rolling attachments. That gives you all the O-rings that you need. And so if you need to order anything, that's the number you need for the O-rings.
Please visit us at www.cjwinter.com for additional information.